Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. We are delighted that you can be with us on this beautiful Saturday afternoon as we kick off our special summer and fall exhibition, This is a Portrait If I Say So, Identity in American Art, 1912 to Today. I'm Anne Collins Goodyear, co-director with my husband Frank of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. Today, I have the pleasure of wearing a second hat, that of co-curator for our exhibition, together with my two colleagues, Dr. Kathleen Campagnolo, an independent curator and scholar based in Lisbon, Portugal, and Dr. Jonathan Walz, Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of American Art at the Columbus Museum in Columbus, Georgia. As you know, the question of identity, how we see ourselves and how we understand others, is central to each of our experience in the world. The question of how we represent identity is of equally pressing significance. How do we wear our hair? What clothes do we like? How do we enjoy spending our time? What do we most want others to understand about us? Questions such as these are very much at the center of This is a Portrait If I Say So. The exhibition takes its title from Robert Rauschenberg's provocative 1961 telegram to Iris Clert, submitted for an exhibition featuring portraits of the gallerist. This is a portrait of Iris Clert, if I say so, read Rauschenberg's submission. This revolutionary work of art currently hangs in the opening gallery of our exhibition. Rauschenberg both drew on traditions of the past, such as the example of Gertrude Stein and Marcel Duchamp, both of whom are also represented in the exhibition, and helped to pave the way for future directions in portraiture. While many of us may think we have an idea of what a traditional portrait looks like, perhaps with a head, a face, maybe a body, we also have to admit that there are times that inherited traditions may not best suit our aims. In a century of exceptional change, from 1912 to today, we have witnessed 2 world wars, the popularization of the automobile, the rise of the computer and social media, the civil rights and women's movements, the decoding of the human genome, and the attacks of September 11th, 2001, to name but a few transformative events. Side by side with such political, social, technological, and scientific change, we have also witnessed several revolutions in the realm of artistic expression, including the birth of abstraction and conceptual art, as well as the introduction of numerous new media and techniques of representation. Thus, the birth of new artistic possibilities and strategies have given artists new opportunities to reconceive of the representation of the self. This is a portrait, if I say so, then, reflects the efforts of artists to move away from inherited traditions to find new means of authentically portraying others as well as depicting themselves in fashion that reflect their experience of self in their own day and age. As this exhibition reflects, in doing so, contemporary artists continue to look across time and to one another for inspiration and support. While new strategies for portraiture are not limited to the United States, this exhibition focuses on the American experience, particularly poignant in a nation with an ethos of self-invention and reinvention, where identity is inherently flexible. To this end, Americanness is conceived broadly, and the exhibition includes artists whose careers have been meaningfully shaped by working or living in the United States. We hope you will enjoy the exhibition, which will be on view until October 23rd. As you know, No exhibition happens in a vacuum. It reflects the efforts of numerous individuals whose hard work and vision make it possible to imagine and execute a project of this scale. Together with my co-director and my co-curators, I would like to thank and acknowledge, in particular, the individuals and organizations that have done so much to make possible This Is a Portrait If I Say So, and the accompanying catalog. Our first thanks is to the staff and interns of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, who have truly worked tirelessly to bring artistic masterpieces to Bowdoin and to have installed them and who have developed numerous resources available both online and in person to enhance our understanding and enjoyment of the exhibition. Next, we thank the museum's Advisory Council, the Bowdoin College trustees, Dean of Academic Affairs Jennifer Scanlon, and President Clayton Rose for their unflagging encouragement of the museum's many programs. We also wish to offer a very special expression of appreciation to the numerous generous funders whose support has been essential. We thank the Henry Luce Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, Eric and Svetlana Silverman, Edward and Carolyn Hyman, the Becker Fund for the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, the Elizabeth B.G. Hamlin Fund, the Devonwood Foundation, Hallie K. Harrisburg and Michael Rosenfeld, Mary and John McGuigan, Thomas and Hannah McKinley, the Stevens L. Frost Endowment Fund, Mary O'Connell and Peter Grua, an anonymous donor, the Chappelle Family Art Fund, and the Roy A. Hunt Foundation. Thanks to such extraordinary support, this afternoon we are privileged to hear from one of the artists whose work is on view in This Is a Portrait If I Say So, Byron Kim. Byron has been a key contributor to our project, not only because of his celebrated portrait abstractions, but also because of the superb questions and contributions he has made to the conversations behind this exhibition. With characteristic generosity, Byron joined my co-curators and myself and other esteemed colleagues in the spring of 2013 for a curatorial roundtable hosted by the Research and Academic Program at the Clark Art Institute to discuss the goals of this show. Since that time, he has been an active participant in conversations about the exhibition, several of which have actively involved Bowdoin students. Byron is both an artist and a subject of portraits in the exhibition, and so has an invaluable perspective to share with us. Byron is undoubtedly one of the leading artists of our era. In addition to being an exceptionally productive painter, he is a senior critic at Yale University. He received his BA from Yale in 1983 and has been both a student and faculty member at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture here in Maine. He has received numerous awards, including the Alfred Award, U-Cross, and Joan Mitchell Foundation grant. His work has been exhibited around the world and has been collected by numerous major museums, including, to name only a few, the National Gallery of Art, the Albright Knox Art Gallery, the Hirshhorn Museum, the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Today, we feel enormously lucky to share his work with our audiences and to hear his insights. Following Byron's comments, my co-curators and I will join him on stage for a conversation. At the conclusion of our formal program, we hope you will join us for a public celebration of the show on the steps of the museum. And now, please join me in welcoming Byron Kim.
I'd like to thank Anne for inviting me and congratulate Anne and Kathleen and Jonathan for an amazing exhibition. And also to thank Haley Beeman, who's Bowdoin 2018, who offered invaluable help putting together this lecture. I'm going to try to make one point about portraiture, and if I don't manage to, later you can ask me what that one point was. And then I'm going to show some of my work, and then a few slides of works of friends of mine who are all in the show. So when I thought to make a talk about portraits, I wanted to, and with regard to this show especially, I wanted to start by talking about portraits that we don't doubt as portraits. And the first one that popped into my mind was this pretty famous work by Alice Neel of Andy Warhol. And so I've included it because it's so clearly fits within the definition of a portrait, but because it includes the sitter's body and likeness, but also seems to try to go beyond that, seems to try to transcend that and somehow capture something of the inner life of the subject. So this is a portrait of Warhol by Richard Avedon, which is virtually exactly the same subject matter. Not only do we get Andy, but we get his body. And I wonder if it's around the same time. I should have looked that up, but I'm not a scholar, as you'll see. I think this might be another portrait by Avedon because it's exactly the same clothing, and it seems to be very close to that time. These next few slides are of Andy Warhol by Robert Mapplethorpe. And this is my personal favorite portrait of Andy. It's some of you may know of it. It's well, you'll understand the title of it once I play it. It's by the filmmaker Juergen Leth, Danish filmmaker, who's best known as, unfortunately, he's probably best known as Lars von Trier's teacher.
My name is Andy Warhol, and I just finished eating a hamburger.
Bowdoin, New York.
So that's one scene in a film, I guess a feature-length film, which I've never seen, of Juergen Leth. I think it's called 66 Scenes of America, and I assume none of the other 65 scenes has anything to do with Warhol. Leth is quoted as saying about this scene, "This particular scene is the artistic essence of Andy Warhol in all its simplicity." And these are various portraits of Andy that I found online. Most of them are self-portraits. Some of them I wasn't able to attribute very easily. And it's, to me, looking at these portraits, it's interesting to think about Andy Warhol's body. And in that film, he seems perfectly comfortable in his body, yet profoundly uncomfortable. He almost seems unable to embody his own body. These are self-portraits. So, I've had the pleasure of having this weekly early morning hour-long discussion with Anne Goodyear and two current Bowdoin students, Haley Beeman, who I mentioned. Did I mention her in the beginning? And June Lay. It's been really amazing and great. We are talking about doing something in relationship to this show. It's not quite clear what it will be yet. During one of the discussions, the subject of Claudia Rankine's great recent book of poetry and essays, it's really poetry, called Citizen, an American Lyric, came up, and June and I happened to have heard Claudia Rankine speak about this work and read from it very recently in New York. And the poet mentioned that the whole work was written in the second person, and she mentioned, she described various reasons why that ultimately that needed to be. And as I started to think about that and think about this talk and looking at portraiture, I started to look at everything through those grammatical points of view, and wondered whether these portraits were third person or more, maybe more intimate and second person. So I'm going to show some of them again. This is Avedon, and if you look at the two, again, if you look at the two Avedon photos and then think about them and look at them in relation to the subsequent 4 or 5 Mapplethorpe photos, and especially concentrate on Andy's eyes, you'll see, I mean, there are many differences between these and these. And then there's, back to this painting. I thought about this painting again, and I wondered, maybe it's not even a question of whether it's the second person or third person, but maybe these works are actually in the first person. That is, maybe these works are actually self-portraits, not portraits of Andy at all, but portraits of Avedon, Mapplethorpe, and Neil in some regard. So, to try to prove my one point, here's the self-portrait of Alice Neal, and does that have more in relation to this than, let's say, it does to that? So that's my one point, and I actually managed to make it. So now I'm just going to move on, and this is pretty good segue. This is from, I think it's from Warhol's 13 Wanted Men work or series, which was censored in the 1964 World's Fair, which was in Queens, New York. I won't go into that whole story, but I just include it because conventional portraits rely on likeness and likeness of the body, and so they're all kinds of portraits. You know, mostly I've been showing you portraits by artists. This is also a portrait by an artist, but it uses as its subject a different kind of portrait, which is the mugshot, which is, you know, a likeness that people don't like to be associated with. Nevertheless, it's just like those other likenesses. It's trying to to copy the way the body looks. This is a work that's in the show that also refers to these mug shots. It's by Marcel Duchamp. Before I came here, and actually, could somebody take is it possible? Okay, good, great, thanks. Before I got here, I was in Norfolk, Connecticut at Yale's Norfolk Summer Program, which is a great old school for art and music during the summer, and I met this young man named Rodolfo Diaz, and encountered this work of his that has to do with when he was a graffiti artist and was incarcerated briefly, and that whole experience. And he asked if he was he told me a lot about the experience and how difficult it was, and he actually asked if I could. He was so moved that I was going to use this in this lecture that he asked if I would take a picture of me talking about this, because his father thinks that he shouldn't be using this photograph in an artwork. And so he wants to tell his father that it was used in a lecture at Bowdoin College. This is Rodolfo at Norfolk. And so my greater point is that, you know, that's Rodolfo's body in the previous image, and it's also his body in this image, and it's just two totally different senses of this being. Oh, this is a very drastic segue. So here's another portrait. It's by JacquesLouis David, and the reason why I'm including it is not utterly arbitrary. I actually made a work about this. It's the beginning of this section of my works. It's a portrait, the David painting is a portrait of Antoine Lavoisier, who people consider to be the father of modern chemistry, and his wife, Anne-Marie Pauls, who happened to be a drawing student of David. You can see her portfolio in the center left of the portrait. This is owned by the Met. It's huge. The figures are about life size, maybe bigger than life size. So I have, speaking of drawing student, I have always wondered what those people at encyclopedic museums sitting there with their French easels copying masterworks, what their relationship was to what I do, because I tend to copy things also. So I went to the Met and I applied. You have to have two letters of recommendation. I got them from two of my best friends, and they're supposed to be able to attest to your ability to copy in this way, which they would be lying if they did try to attest to that. So they didn't. They just said that I was, reliable or something. And from this slide, you can tell one of the two rules that I remember, which is that you can't make a work bigger than 30 by 30 inches, so that decided my size. And then you have to alter the scale by at least 10%, which I didn't do. I made the same. I mean, it was to, obviously those rules are to prevent your walking out with a forgery, which is not at issue in my case. This is me maybe midway through this project of copying part of this painting. And the first day I started this painting, the guard walks up to me and says, "Hey, you're not painting the whole painting." I said, "Yeah, is that okay? I'm just painting this part of her dress because I'm really not qualified to paint the whole painting. And it's really what I'm more interested in anyway." And he said, "Wow, that's really interesting, because I've been working here over 25 years and I've never seen anyone paint part of the painting," which I found really astonishing. That is the finished painting in front of its subject, and it looks much better in this slide than it does in person. In fact, I've never figured out where the artwork is in this work. I once did display the painting on an easel in a group show, but the closest I think I came to an artwork was during the course of my painting this painting. There was a Leonardo da Vinci show right behind me, and there was this long line constantly just looking over my shoulder asking me what the hell I was doing. And that my interaction with the crowd, I think, might have been close to an artwork. This is a painting of my mother's skin color from memory. I could easily have done what I usually do, which is to look at something and copy its color, but I thought that since an infant's, a child's relationship to their mother's skin is kind of akin to the subject matter of the New York school painters who I've always been enamored of. I thought that I would do it from memory and make it more kind of romantic in that way, or try to make it about something too large for words, when I usually make things that are sort of too or make subject matter that's kind of very specific and almost too small for words. So that's a large painting. The one anecdote about this is that my mother had a very thriving obstetric OBGYN practice, and she barely ever took any time off, and this was the first show that she could take time to come to the opening, and the only thing she had to say after the opening wasn't, something. She didn't even tell me specifically that she was talking about this painting, but she just said, "It's too dark." This painting has a little bit to do with my mom also. When I was in kindergarten, apparently I told my mom, I had gone to school with this shirt. It was a turtleneck with very thin stripes, and it was a very particular green, kind of an olive green, and the other stripe, I don't remember if it was navy or black, but a very dark blue, if it was blue. Miss Mashinsky, my teacher, said, "Byron, that's a nice shirt." And so the next day when my mom was getting me ready for school, I said, "Mom, that shirt that I wore yesterday, I have to wear it again today." And she said that I wore it 3 weeks. I insisted on wearing it for 3 weeks straight. This is a portrait. I've included this section of things that are portraits, but I never thought of them as portraits before this whole interaction with you guys. So this is a portrait of my palms. It's a self-portrait, and it's partly because this palm has a really straight line, really strong straight line across it. I've subsequently destroyed this painting at the criticism of my wife Lisa, who's a much better artist than I am, actually, true. And part of the reason that this picture failed was that I relied too much on a photograph. I was working from a photograph, partly because it's really hard to paint your right palm while you're right-handed. But it just, this line is straight, but the photograph didn't say that, so I didn't do that, which is really stupid. So I thought I would train myself to make the right painting, and so I'd been making these studies that are 1-to-1 the size of my palms, and people say that they're much better, and Lisa says don't bother making the big painting, because she likes these much better. I thought this would become a series, maybe it still will. There are just a couple of them, a few. This is a painting of my first 2 children's cowlicks. It's called Whirl, W-H-O-R-L, Emmett and Ella. They're very small. They're also 1-to-1. This is a version of the work that's in the show when it was at the Whitney Biennial in 1993. It's called Synecdoche, which is also a term of grammar, meaning a part that stands for the whole. And I guess there are many things that this work means, many of which I didn't intend, but one of them is that a very particular aspect of the body is such an inadequate representation of the self. This is the signage. The subjects are in alphabetical order by first name. Did I mention that it was of people's skin color? Or maybe that's obvious. So this interesting thing, it's now owned by the National Gallery, so people are constantly sending me selfies with the work. It's Tom Perrotta, my college roommate and now famous novelist. Addie, who's in the audience. This is another work that's in the show, Emmett at 12 months, which tries to represent 25 colors on his body when he was a year old, not just skin color. That's Emmett. at that time, approximately. That's Emmett just a couple of years ago, maybe. So the other big series that I've made is, I started in January of 2001. I make a small painting, 14 by 14 inches, so that it can fit in a carry-on bag. I make a painting every Sunday, and then I write kind of a journal entry, and then I record the time and the place. So there are over 700 of these. You might be able to read that even. So this goes slightly, these last few couple go a little further afield. This is a portrait of my house, in a way, the house that I grew up in Wallingford, Connecticut. I gave these 3 identical paint chip charts to my 3 family members and asked them to circle the one that they thought that was the color of our house, and this is the one I got back from my sister, which included the address, which I couldn't have remembered, and which became the title of the work, which is simply 7 of their choices repeated and then rollered on in-house paint on 8x4 sheet of plywood. This is another portrait of a building. I mean, it's strange. I never thought of those other things as portraits, but I often do refer to this as a portrait of the UN building. So I won't go into that whole story, but it just has to do with driving up and down the FDR, and this is sort of the New Yorker's view of the UN. This is kind of a long story too, but it's simply a portrait of a car that I drove for a long time in hot, medium, and caustic, so very much thinking about Bryce Marden's early work. And it has the 2 vinyl colors on left and center, and then the exterior paint color on the right. So these are my friend's work, and they're the last few slides. This is Inigo Mangalano Avae's, I don't know the exact title, but DNA portrait, Emmett, Lisa, Byron, and Emmett, maybe in that order, Byron, Lisa, and Emmett. This is the part of the Runaway series of prints of Glenn Ligon, who is my good friend and studio neighbor. And this is the one that I wrote, and he was somewhat offended by it when I gave it to him, because I mean, the slightly orange thing is definitely something only I would say, but I think he was offended by the seemingly well-educated thing, just because I think it has to do with my having gone to Yale and his having gone to Wesleyan. And another student just slightly further down the hall is Janine Antoni. We've been studio neighbors for a long time now, maybe 15 years or more. And this is a work, she has 2 works in the show, but this is not a work in the show. This is a self-portrait, which she's doing now, called Paper Dance, and it's in response to Anna Halperin's 1965 work, whose name I'm forgetting now. It's a famous work, and in Janine's version of it, she has many, like 27 years worth of sculpture in crates, and as she's doing the dance, she randomly chooses one to uncrate while you watch the dance. I haven't actually seen it yet, but I'm really looking forward to seeing it next month at the Fabric Workshop. And this is not a friend of mine. I wish it had been. He had been a friend of mine. But I still think he's the best artist of my generation, Felix Gonzalez Torres. And I'm not sure if this was a portrait of two particular people, but it's called Perfect Lovers, and it's two clocks that are run on batteries, and they start off perfectly synchronized, and then they go off sync, and eventually one stops, and the other one does too. And that's it. And so I'm happy to receive my friends up here, and then we'll talk and be happy to receive questions too.
Oh, you got something? Okay, good. Byron, thank you very much. That was extraordinary.
Yeah, it happened.
I think I'll turn the floor over actually to my co-curators and give them the opportunity to perhaps, would either one, Jonathan, would you want to get the ball rolling and perhaps engage Byron with a question?
You can ask me a question about the show. Or I can ask you a question about the show.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Can I ask you a question I already asked you?
Sure.
Because they don't know. That amazing piece. Oh, God. Maybe I can make it more general. How did you find a lot of the work in the show that's just so, some work that seems really, to me, kind of obscure, but really perfect?
My dissertation research involved artists in the Stieglitz circle and their engagement with unconventional portraiture. And so kind of as I started working on that particular project, I just became like a vacuum cleaner, and anytime I saw something related, I would just put it in a file. So that's a good segue into the thought that there's only about 60 works in the exhibition, but we must have talked as curators about like 200 or something. Like we had a binder that big.
Would you like to have made it a much bigger show?
Part of us, I think, says yes, but I think we've also really appreciated the tightness of this particular installation. I think for me, as someone who's been interested in this idea for a long time and then did my dissertation work on it, I was really hoping to illustrate examples or bring to the fore, to the public's attention, examples that have not really received a lot of attention. I think everybody sort of is somewhat familiar with Charles Demuth's Figure 5 in Gold, for example, at the Met, because it's at the Met and it gets a lot of press. But some of these other examples, I was particularly interested in sort of broadening the discourse around particular examples.
So I have a question. What do you think of my thesis that mimetic portraiture is inadequate because it's limited to the body?
Can you say that again?
Come on, that was the one point I made during my lecture. I said I was asking you what you think of my point that maybe, now I'm like retracting, mimetic portraiture is less adequate because it is limited to the body.
Oh. I mean, I think that's been a frustration of mine, even before I began my project, is that, I don't know, sort of having some kind of intuitive belief as a young person that we're more than our appearance, that I'm a spiritual person, so I think that there's actually way more going on than we can see in the world. And I don't mean to get all mystical and weird, but I think yes, I will. So I related this anecdote last night at the vernissage. I was in 3rd grade, and the school system that I was in, they had decided, I think this was an economic decision, that they actually, the school system was party to a local cable channel. And so instead of having art teachers in every single school, they just had one art teacher who would teach the lesson on TV. So we would all sort of tune in. So I think that's important because the teacher who actually then was monitoring the classroom was just my homeroom teacher, not necessarily an art teacher. So we were tasked with providing self-portraits with sort of the expectation, of course, that the end result would bear some resemblance to us as students. And we learned about the proportion of the face, like the eyes are sort of 1/3 and all of that stuff. And so I guess we had mirrors, I don't really remember, but I remember being really frustrated that I couldn't draw my nose the way that I wanted to, that it just I could not get a foreshortened nose correct on a 2-dimensional piece of paper. And so I thought that I would figure out how to create a self-portrait without my nose. And so I ended up deciding to draw a big red circle where my nose would normally be and to make my skin like grease paint white colored, and I put a big red mop of hair on top of my head. And needless to say, my 3rd grade teacher was horrified by this, and I was sent to the principal's office. I think, so last night I said, as an adult, sort of reflecting back on that experience, which of course as a child I was just completely overwhelmed and completely humiliated about having to go to the principal's office, who was actually very understanding, I should say, and asked me, I think one of the reasons why I ended up in the principal's office was because the teacher just didn't know how to contain my rambunctious, outside-the-box energy. And so I was mollified by being offered sort of additional art lessons outside of class. So it all worked out. But anyway, so because, I think because she was older and she wasn't an art teacher herself, and she had this very clear idea that the assignment could only be completed in one way, and because I didn't follow that direction, it really kind of freaked her out. And so as an adult, realizing that there are very deeply entrenched historical traditions that as a child you're not even really aware of. But then sort of realizing that there are people who are very interested in maintaining those traditions and policing those boundaries. And so my 3rd grade teacher happened to be one of them. But I think something that hasn't come up a lot when we've talked about this, but there is a lot of irreverence and humor in the exhibition. And so I can remember as a child the kind of thrill that I received from sort of receiving attention, even though it ended up being negative attention, but for doing something completely different and sort of breaking the rules that sort of kind of felt almost ecstatic in a way. Of course, I wish it had turned out more positively, but I think that realization that pushing and transgressing had some kind of productive value.
There's a lot of humor in the middle section.
Yeah, usually.
Eleanor Anton, what's his name, art and language?
Joseph Kossuth.
Joseph Kossuth. The Flavin is kind of funny.
Yes, definitely. One of the things that you mentioned that I got out of the first part of your talk was the idea that the portrait becomes a self-portrait of the artist as well, particularly in the case of the Warhol and the Alice Neel, where you really see it as almost a portrait of Alice Neel as well. And you seem to suggest that maybe that wasn't the case with the non-mimetic portraits, but maybe it wasn't. Was that your?
I didn't really weigh in on that, but I wouldn't try to make that point.
Because
it's not sustainable.
So many of the portraits really say as much about the artists as they do about the subjects, and almost more.
Okay.
And in the case of the non-mimetic portraits, you almost get more of a sense of the artist than you do of the subject in many cases.
Right. Well, that's really clear, but I guess I was trying to make the point that in the mimetic portraits, especially photography, you wouldn't think that would be the case
Right.
so much.
Sure.
So your talk made me realize, of course, for the dissertation, I had to do all kinds of theoretical research about previous thoughts about portraiture, and something from the Renaissance even is this idea that an artist's work is much more about the artist than whatever the ostensible subject. So that's actually a very old idea.
Oh. Sorry.
It's an interesting concept. I think Michelangelo said something like every artist paints himself. But I have to say, one of the things that has been really gratifying to me, and speaking as a historian, is watching in the exhibition, because I've learned a lot just from seeing it up on the walls, even though I thought I knew these pieces. I've been really touched by how deeply contemporary artists in the final section of the exhibition are obviously engaging with art of the past and deeply absorbing the lessons and recasting them as something new. So to hear you make that observation is very powerful. And I thought I knew Alice Neel, and I never thought of those works as self-portraits of other sitters, but I think you're right. It's very powerful. We have just a few minutes before our reception begins, and I know that will be an opportunity to discuss many of these issues with one another. But while we are together, I'd love to throw the floor open for questions. I know a number of people in the audience, certainly not everyone, but I know there are a lot of very interesting people who are part of this conversation, and we'd love to hear your thoughts if you'd care to share questions or observations. And we have microphones for you. We're recording this, so good to use a mic if you don't mind. Thank you.
The show is extremely finely installed, and you've been sharing with us the amount of time and the tremendous thoughtful way in which you formulated your ideas. Have you, in turn, thought of this whole project as portraits of yourselves?
That's a really interesting question, Catherine. And funny enough, I have to admit, I actually had not. Although Jonathan made a really nice point yesterday that I found very touching. He made the point that just as the exhibition seeks to make the point that identity is very fluid and unfixed, that the show itself was actually conceived with many different voices participating. There are 3 curators in name. A 4th contributor, Dorinda Evans, prepared a wonderful essay, which is part of the catalog. She was part of a number of conversations. Byron and a number of other colleagues were kind enough to be part of a roundtable at the Clark. Students here, lots of other colleagues have, I think, helped refine and shape our thinking. But as for being a self-portrait, I have to give that a little bit more thought, but it's certainly an interesting idea. I don't know, maybe my other colleagues wish to respond.
Are each of you attached to one of the sections? Yes. So do you resemble a section?
I had another point and now I forget. I know what I was going to say. There's an amazing essay by Helen Molesworth in the Dada, the transcriptions of the Dada seminar that was held at the National Gallery, I think. And in it, she calls it Aroselavi Goes Shopping, and she makes this connection between how identity is conveyed based on the choices that we make. So in that sense, and she's talking about economic choices in everyday life, but I think if we're using the model of making choices, that's what curators do. So in a sense, of course, it's kind of a portrait of us based on the choices that we made to then show all of you.
Thank you so much for this illuminating talk, Byron. I really appreciate it. And the show brought up some questions for me, especially when we think about portraiture and its attachments to individuality, especially when we discuss notions of identity. And what's become clear to me as an art historian is that this is actually a lot about community, that a picture of one's community starts to emerge in each section of the exhibition. And one's identity has so much to do with one's access to certain communities. And I wondered if you might speak to the sort of other side of identity, which is one's community. I mean, there are a lot of cross-references to multiple influences that artists have chosen to capture through their portraiture. And of course, there are many other communities that probably engage in similar practices that aren't interconnected in the same way with sort of a certain group. So that's kind of complicated, but I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
I think early on we realized that this trope of non-mimetic portraiture often had a kind of almost in-joke or internal to a particular group kind of dynamic to it. And I think, especially for me, working on my dissertation and sort of even framing my research around a particular cluster of people, and I think that was able to happen because the avant-garde in New York in the teens was so small that communication amongst those people was fairly easy and the ideas remained fairly coherent. But as time goes on, I think we see that the avant-garde becomes larger and ways of communicating those ideas become slightly more challenging, so that the ideas start to morph and mutate in interesting ways. But I think for myself, why I've always been interested in the Stieglitz circle is because there is this sense of camaraderie, really, and how, that they're not just friends with each other, but they're encouraging each other, they're informing each other's work, that there really is a kind of a conversation that's happening across different artistic practices. But also, to speak to your point, I mean, I think what's really fascinating to me about L.J. Roberts' embroidery in the show, which I just barely mention in the catalog entry, but that this kind of imagined community across time, right? That LJ's piece has a reference to a button by, is it General Idea? It's Grand Fury. It's a button with a logo by Grand Fury, who borrowed the graphic language of Love by Robert Indiana, who himself is then looking back to artists like Demuth. So there is also this kind of transtemporal community, I think, that kind of starts to form, which I was really interested in the exhibition.
Speaking a little bit to that, but also to go back to Byron's question of how we how have we found what's in the show and how we selected it. As you know, the exhibition focuses on 3 historical moments, but in developing the project, we looked at non-mimetic portraits that span over 100 years, and it's not that they only happen during these times, but one of the things we discovered was that there seemed to be these kind of bursts of activity within communities at these times, and it became an opportunity for us to focus on a smaller group and look more in depth of why it happens at a certain time and within a certain community. And I think in almost all of the cases, New York really is a focus also. So in the 60s, like in Jonathan's section, it definitely is, you see conversations between a relatively small group of artists who were involved with each other in other ways as well.
Can you tell us any good stories about those artists who were friends with each other or not friends with each other?
Trying to think what's a good story.
Like,
oh.
Yeah, because you discovered the river.
So one of the first works in the second gallery, which is the 1960s, is Jasper John's portrait of Viola Farber. The piece that we have in the exhibition is a print that he did in 1972. But it refers to a painting that he did in 1961 and 62, which is a large-scale gray and caustic painting that has an element that is cut out of the canvas and opens. And there are a spoon and a fork that fold out of the center of the canvas, and they are joined by a large rubber band. And Viola Farber's name is stenciled twice at the bottom right of the canvas. And I was looking at the painting and thinking, what does this tell me about Viola Farber? Why is this Viola Farber? And I read several biographies about her, and she was one of the founding members of the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, which Johns became involved with through his, with Robert Rauschenberg. And in reading about her, I discovered that in '61, she premiered a new dance by Cunningham titled Crisis, and it was performed in front of a black scrim, and there was like a fog machine. It wasn't a fog machine, but something that created a mist. The costumes were by Rauschenberg, and in part of the dance, she does a duet with Cunningham in which they attach themselves with large rubber bands and dance kind of around each other. And so in my catalog essay, I speculate that this portrait potentially is a reference to a specific dance, so it's talking about Viola Farber and her work as a dancer. And after we went to press, I discovered a small sketch that he did of that preceded the painting called Crisis, Portrait of Viola Farber. So I was delighted to know that that association was accurate.
And I might just offer one other observation about community and self-portraiture, if I might. One of the things that's been really extraordinary, I think, for all of us about this show is the numerous conversations we've had with artists and other colleagues about this work. And I have to say, as a historian, I like nothing more than to hear why artists do what they do. And one of the more, well, we had so many fascinating conversations. A conversation that I found particularly intriguing that has colored my thinking about the exhibition, and Catherine may continue to color my response to your question, was a story that we heard from Roni Horn about a piece called A Sphere, which is in the exhibition. And A sphere is not a sphere, but the use of A as a prefix in the sense of meaning something that it's not, like asymmetrical. And so you'll see it in the exhibition. It almost looks like it could be a deflated beach ball or balloon. And when we visited with her, she asked us whether or not it was a self-portrait. So we weren't sure. And she began to talk about it as an object that she had come to recognize as a self-portrait after she made it. So it wasn't produced with the intention of being a self-representation, but after she made it and she realized that it wasn't a sphere, but it wasn't anything else she could name either, she began to feel a kinship with that object. And she felt that everything about it that was not categorizable was in fact a reflection of who she was inside. And what I find so interesting is, in a sense, it requires a community to express that. And I think part of what has been fascinating to me is that portraiture only exists when we are in fact able to exchange a sense of self or enter into conversations with others. So in fact, I would have to say that it is because of all of you that those artworks constitute some form of portraiture, or perhaps not. I think that's for you to decide. But to I think I can speak for my fellow curators with whom I've had many conversations, but one of the things we ultimately really loved about Rauschenberg's comment, "This is a portrait if I say so," is that the I becomes whoever it is that articulates that phrase. And so I think on that note, I will invite all of you to determine whether or not it is a portrait if you say so. And we very much hope that you'll enjoy the show and that we can have an opportunity to speak further with you at the reception and throughout the summer and fall and months and years beyond the official closing of the exhibition here. We're so glad you could be with us. I want to offer a very warm thanks to Kathleen Campagnolo, Jonathan Walz, and Byron Kim for all they have done to make this such an extraordinary experience and such a great project. And thanks to each of you for being part of it.